The Speaking of Cults podcast is presented solely for general informational, educational, and entertainment purposes. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from it is at the user's own risk. The views, information, or opinions expressed by the host and guests are solely those of the individuals involved and do not constitute medical or other professional advice. Hello and welcome to the Speaking of Cults podcast. I'm your host, Chris Shelton. Thank you very much for joining me today. We're going to dive pretty deep today, and we're not going to take a long time to do it, but I have some key facts and maybe even a little bit of history to go over with you today to help us understand our world and why it's a little crazier than it needs to be right now, and why it is that it feels a little cultier than it should. Let's take a look. Today, we're tackling one of the defining challenges of our time, the concept of post-truth. Now, you've probably heard the term before. It's been thrown around in political debates, news commentary, and even memes. But what does it really mean? At its core, post-truth describes a world where objective facts take a back seat to emotions, personal beliefs, and narratives. It's not just about lying. It's about creating an environment where truth feels subjective, where facts are dismissed as fake news, and where the loudest voice often drowns out the most accurate one. This shift hasn't just happened overnight. It's the result of decades of change in how we consume information and how we view institutions and how technology amplifies voices, for better and for worse. So how did we get here? Today, we're going to explore the history of news media, the rise of social media and influencer culture, the growing polarization of our societies, and even the psychological biases that make us all complicit in this environment. And yes, we'll also talk about the role of billionaires because, let's face it, when it comes to media and public discourse, they've had their hands on the steering wheel for quite some time. By the end of this episode, I hope you'll have a clearer picture of how these forces have converged to create our post-truth world, and what, if anything, we can do about it. So let's dive in and unravel the tangled web of facts, opinions, and outright falsehoods that defines our media landscape today. Our story begins in the 1960s, a time often remembered as the golden age of journalism. Back then, the media landscape was dominated by just a few major networks: CBS, NBC, and ABC. Figures like Walter Cronkite weren't just trusted, they were revered. Cronkite, often called the most trusted man in America, shaped public opinion with his integrity. When he delivered his famous critique of the Vietnam War, it wasn't just news, it was a turning point in American discourse. Back then, trust in the media was high, and journalism was seen as a pillar of democracy. The 1970s built on this trust with groundbreaking investigative journalism. The Washington Post's reporting on the Watergate scandal, which ultimately led to President Nixon's resignation, showed the power of a free press to hold power accountable. The release of the Pentagon Papers by the New York Times exposed government lies about Vietnam, further solidifying journalism's role as a watchdog. Unfortunately, it also began planting many seeds of doubt in the minds of the American public about whether their government was actually trustworthy. To understand how today's media environment took shape, we need to look back at the presidency of Ronald Reagan, who served from 1981 to 1989. Reagan's administration implemented sweeping changes to government policy, with a focus on deregulation across many industries, including media. These policies fundamentally altered the way media companies operated and laid the groundwork for the consolidation of media power that we see today. The Reagan administration embraced a philosophy of free market economics, often referred to as Reaganomics or trickle-down economics. A cornerstone of this philosophy was the belief that less government intervention would spur competition and innovation, while profits from the corporate elite would somehow trickle down magically to the working and lower classes. That last part never happened. The concentration of wealth by denying the flow of money organically to the middle and lower classes began here. Trickle-down was supposed to fill the gap that was left by greedy corporations internalizing profits only for shareholders and the C-suite executives. And this began an economic disparity which has fueled so much of the anxiety and anger the American public feel towards the government and big business. And when it came to news media, deregulation had the opposite effect. It led to the concentration of power in fewer hands. One of the most significant moments in this era was the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine in 1987. You may have heard some reference to this every now and again, but it's mainly been forgotten, so let's break this down. What was the Fairness Doctrine? The Fairness Doctrine was a Federal Communications Commission, or FCC, policy introduced in 1949. It required broadcasters to present controversial issues of public importance in a manner that was honest, equitable, and balanced. Broadcasters didn't just have to air multiple perspectives. They had to make a genuine effort to ensure that all sides of an issue were fairly represented. The doctrine was rooted in the idea that broadcast frequencies were a public resource. Since the number of radio and television channels was limited in the mid-20th century, broadcasters were seen as having a responsibility to serve the public interest. In practice, the Fairness Doctrine encouraged broadcasters to avoid overtly partisan content. While it didn't ban political commentary or advocacy, it created a disincentive for programming that could be seen as too one-sided, because broadcasters would need to allocate time for opposing views. This fostered a media environment that leaned toward moderation and balance. By the late 70s and early 80s, individuals like Rupert Murdoch, Roger Ailes, and Ted Turner felt that certain partisan voices were not being heard loudly enough, and decided they needed to do something about that. Ailes went from political consulting and television production for Richard Nixon to become the CEO of Fox News in 1996 under Murdoch's ownership. As just one example of what Ailes brought to the table, he was credited with the orchestra pit theory regarding sensationalist political coverage in the news media, which originated with him saying, quote, "If you have two guys on a stage, and one guy says, 'I have a solution to the Middle East problem,' and the other guy falls in the orchestra pit, who do you think is going to be on the evening news?" End quote. The truth meant nothing to Roger Ailes any more than it did to famous yellow journalist proponent William Randolph Hearst, and very little to billionaires like Ted Turner, the billionaire who created CNN. Cable television was on the rise, providing more channels and greater competition. Meanwhile, Reagan's FCC was filled with appointees who believed that government regulation of media was outdated and unnecessary. In 1987, under the leadership of FCC Chairman Dennis Patrick, Reagan's appointee, the FCC voted to abolish the Fairness Doctrine. Patrick and other proponents of repeal argued that the doctrine was no longer needed because the expanding number of media outlets meant that multiple perspectives would naturally emerge. They also claimed the doctrine infringed on broadcasters' First Amendment rights, limiting their freedom to determine their own content. It's worth noting that the repeal didn't require congressional approval. as the Fairness Doctrine was an FCC policy rather than a law. However, there were efforts in Congress to codify the doctrine into law. In 1987, same year it was canceled, a bill to do just that passed both the House and Senate with bipartisan support. And Reagan vetoed it. So there weren't enough votes to override his veto. The repeal was a turning point. Without the Fairness Doctrine, there was no obligation for broadcasters to provide balanced coverage of controversial issues. This opened the door for highly partisan programming to flourish, particularly in talk radio. In short, Reagan not only oversaw one of the most corrupt and openly dishonest presidential administrations in history with the Iran-Contra affair, but he made sure his billionaire buddies were given free rein to literally tell whatever version of reality they wanted to the American public and claim it as the truth. Ronald Reagan is personally responsible for almost everything that has gone wrong with news media in this country, and no one has ever held him or his administration accountable for their crimes. The repeal of the Fairness Doctrine had an almost immediate impact. One of the first beneficiaries was conservative radio host Rush Limbaugh, whose nationally syndicated program debuted in 1988. Limbaugh's brash, unapologetically partisan style was a stark departure from the more moderated tones of previous decades. By the early 1990s, Limbaugh was reaching millions of listeners and inspiring a wave of imitators. This, of course, was one of the gateways for the later acceptance of Fox News, an alternative reality news platform that argued in court in 2021 that one of its news show hosts should not be believed by rational human beings because no one expects him to be telling the truth. This argument worked to dismiss a defamation lawsuit against then Fox host Tucker Carlson. Critics of the repeal argue that it contributed to the erosion of trust in journalism. When audiences can choose media outlets that align with their existing beliefs, they're less likely to encounter opposing perspectives, reinforcing ideological bubbles. Over time, this polarization has made it harder to reach consensus on basic facts. The repeal of the Fairness Doctrine was just one part of a broader trend toward deregulation during the Reagan years. The administration also relaxed rules on media ownership, allowing companies to own more stations and reach larger audiences, and this set the stage for the consolidation of media power. Before Reagan's presidency, there were strict limits on how many TV and radio stations a single company could own. These rules were designed to promote a diversity of ownership and prevent any one entity from dominating the airwaves. But under Reagan, the FCC began loosening these restrictions. It's almost as though Ronald Reagan, a professional actor and media professional, wanted to corrupt the entire institution of news journalism so that conservative voices and propaganda would drown out any effort to speak truth to power or challenge authoritarian conservative policies or institutions. For example, the number of television stations the company could own was increased, and restrictions on cross-ownership, where one company could both own a newspaper and a broadcast station in the same market, were eased. This deregulation fueled a wave of mergers and acquisitions, which one can easily imagine were contrived beforehand. But whether Reagan knew what he was doing, or whether any of the venture capitalists and investors and businessmen knew what they were doing, or whether they were just engaged in a ruthless cash and power grab, what they did worked. By the 1990s and 2000s, media giants like Disney, Comcast, and Viacom had emerged, controlling vast swaths of television, radio, and film. Today, just a handful of conglomerates dominate the industry, limiting the diversity of voices in the media. Looking back, it's clear that the Reagan administration's policies were a turning point for the media industry. They reflected a broader shift in American politics and economics, a shift toward deregulation, privatization, and a belief in the power of markets over government oversight. But when it comes to the media, this experiment has had unintended consequences, many of which we're still grappling with today. And then the 90s brought the internet. Originally positioned and argued for as a free market digital domain where anyone's voice and power could be equalized and where information could be freely distributed anywhere in the world within seconds, it wasn't long before corporate interests, greed, and incredible ignorance turned the internet into a cash grab unlike anything that had come before. Instead of free and open digital systems which anyone could access, locks and guardrails and paywalls quickly became the order of the day, with an advertiser-friendly model slammed into place to justify the expenses. And money was made so quickly and so insanely that we now remember that time as the 90s dot-com bubble. Did anyone learn from those mistakes? Not really. Whereas the governments or major media companies of the world could easily have provided a free and useful internet as a public utility and resource, instead, greed overtook common sense and quickly hardened the internet into a pay-to-play operation. The only trick was that instead of paying cash, we were made to pay with our personal information. And by agreeing to be part of a world where boundaries and good mental health choices simply don't exist. But let's focus on how the internet specifically changed our relationship with news and information. At first, the idea on chat boards and internet chat rooms was that anyone could publish their thoughts, bypassing traditional gatekeepers like editors and producers. And at first, this seemed like a huge win for democracy. But the internet also introduced a flood of information, and not all of it was credible. Without gatekeepers, the quality of content became wildly inconsistent. Legitimate journalists were now competing with bloggers and conspiracy theorists and sensationalist clickbait. By the early 2000s, news networks like CNN and Fox News had embraced the 24-hour news cycle. To fill airtime, they relied increasingly on pundits and opinion panels, blurring the line between analyses and reporting. Rupert Murdoch's influence through Fox News is perhaps the most well-known example of a single billionaire using his power and wealth to brazenly influence public opinion. But he's not alone. Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. Elon Musk owns Twitter, or X. And these figures have enormous power to shape narratives and use that power openly to do so. Why does this matter? Billionaires don't just buy media companies for profit. They buy them for influence. Media shapes public opinion, and controlling narratives helps protect their interests. At the same time, media consolidation has created massive conglomerates like Disney and Comcast. With fewer companies controlling more of what we see and hear, the diversity of perspectives has narrowed, while the number of channels and outlets for information has increased almost exponentially to infinity. Quite the irony. The Iraq War became a stark example of how the media could be manipulated. False narratives about weapons of mass destruction dominated headlines, showing how sensationalism and political agendas could steer public opinion. And with so many voices vying for attention, the news-consuming public also became overwhelmed with too many choices and not enough clarity or media literacy to sort the wheat from the chaff. To add a massive bonfire to what was already a conflagration in the public breakdown of trust toward expertise, authority, and traditional institutions, the mid-2000s brought social media. Platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube turned everyone into a publisher. At first, this seemed empowering. More voices, more perspectives. But here's the catch. Social media algorithms prioritize engagement, not accuracy. Content that provokes strong emotions like anger or outrage is more likely to go viral. This creates a perfect storm for misinformation to spread. And because the internet is built on an advertiser model, the only way corporations get paid is to make sure the consuming public are giving over all of their personal and behavioral information in exchange for so-called free internet stuff. By data harvesting all of their consumers, social media companies and Google covertly turned our personal information into their actual product. And that information is worth billions of dollars to not just advertising companies and manufacturers, but also to governments, ideological and religious groups, and yes, even cults like Scientology. All of them pay top dollar to these data mining companies so they can use our information to manipulate us to stay longer and be even more involved with their apps and platforms. They literally created an addiction model for the internet, knowingly and with malice aforethought, so that they could use us to enrich themselves to the tune of billions upon billions of dollars. Naturally, within 10 years, malicious foreign agencies had figured out how to game these systems to their advantage. The 2016 U.S. presidential election was a turning point. Russian actors exploited social media to spread divisive, false stories, while domestic political campaigns weaponized these platforms to polarize voters. Social media didn't just reflect divisions, it amplified them. This era also saw the rise of influencers who blend entertainment with commentary. Some are responsible, but many spread misinformation, sometimes unintentionally and sometimes not. The result is a world where expertise is undervalued and the loudest voices often overshadow the most informed ones. And finally, let's dig into a little bit the cultural and psychological forces at play. The rise of cultural relativism, where the idea of everyone has their truth, has gained traction. And this has undermined the concept of objective reality. This line of thinking did not originate with the rise of the internet, but one can see how if public anxiety and stress over the nature of truth cannot be resolved in the public domain, then this so-called logic of everyone has their own truth is going to arise to justify the cacophony of disparate voices. Relativism has valid philosophic applications, but when it dominates the public conversation, then polarization is inevitable because people lack common ground to agree on what's right or wrong and good and bad and true and false. And then there's human psychology, that bugbear we're talking about on this podcast all the time. Human beings are not inherently rational creatures. We are emotionally driven animals that have the capacity for rational, logical thinking, but only when we're not being overly emotional in the moment. We're hardwired to prefer simple, emotionally resonant stories over complex truths. This makes us vulnerable to conspiracy theories and misinformation, which offer easy answers in a confusing and chaotic world. So, is this the whole story? Well, it's a big part of it, but it's not the only part. There's also economic pressures and the decline of local news and the global authoritarian trends that are going on all over the world right now. The post-truth era that we are in right now is a bit of a perfect storm, a result of decisions made by individuals, institutions, and society as a whole. Fighting back against post-truth culture and the spread of disinformation requires individual action, collective effort, and systemic change. Here are some concrete steps that you, as an individual listener today, can take, and that groups that you can join or support to make a meaningful impact. And let me just go over a few bullet point items here. 1, develop media literacy skills. Now, this is just simply not an option anymore in today's digitally driven disinformation world. If you cannot differentiate truth from false information, then your life is going to be negatively impacted. So media literacy is vital. Another thing that you can do is support independent journalism, because clearly we have very, very big systemic and institutional problems with corporate media for all the reasons I've laid out today. You can advocate for platform accountability. And this is very important, not only reporting individual instances of misinformation or disinformation being spread about, but also supporting groups and advocacy activities such as the Center for Humane Technology, which was one of the first groups to actually start calling out the algorithmically driven nonsense that is addicting us to social media. You can foster constructive dialogue, and this is on all of us these days. The past few generations have seen an excessive amount of hyperbolic emotion being expressed on social media. We need to bring that back down, lower the temperature, and get back in touch with each other in the real world, and start eschewing and getting rid of our social media. It is not good for us at pretty much every level of its operation. And we have email, and we have phones, and we actually still have a postal system that works. There are ways to communicate with your friends and family that don't require you to use algorithmically driven social media platforms that are trying to addict you. We can fight polarization by strengthening community bonds as well as interpersonal bonds. Like, just avoid sharing inflammatory content. Try to share things that create unity and common ground rather than efforts to divide and hate. We've had plenty of that for the last 20 years, and here's where it's gotten us. So maybe we should try something different. We can also advocate for policy and legislative change. You can contact your representatives at the city, county, state, and federal level to express support for legislation that addresses disinformation, such as privacy protections, algorithm transparency, and penalties for spreading false information. There are groups that are advocating for this right now. Be part of them. Support fact-checking initiatives as well. Share fact-checked articles and amplify that work. It's all part of the media literacy part, right? Educate yourself also on psychological biases. Now, if you're a regular viewer of this channel, you are well down the path of that already. And I would encourage anyone to check out the critical thinking and psychology-based content here on my channel. There is a legion of it. There's so much discussion here about our cognitive biases and our inability to think logically and how to overcome that. So you can check those things out. Critical thinking is key to all of this. You can promote grassroots movements and local initiatives. You can use technology responsibly by diversifying your media input and output. Don't rely on one or two sources of information. Diversify and challenge yourself. Question yourself. Question your assumptions. Question your beliefs. Question your data sources constantly. It's the only way to ferret out the actual facts of this world. And we live in a complex world, so it takes a little bit of work. Collective action is key. Here are my final thoughts on this today. Fighting disinformation and resisting post-truth culture isn't something any one person can do alone. It requires a collective effort, a web of individuals, organizations, and institutions committed to truth, transparency, and accountability. Whether you're educating yourself, supporting independent journalism, or advocating for systemic change, every action you take really does count and really does make a difference. Don't give in to the preached apathy of our modern age. You do not have to agree with what is going on if you don't agree with what is going on. And you can and should do something about it. Remember, the antidote to a post-truth world is a well-informed, critically thinking public. And that starts with each of us. I want to thank you for coming around and listening to me today. I hope that you found this somewhat entertaining, informative, and educational. And I hope that this has given you some food for thought. If you like this channel and the work that I do here, you might consider supporting me through Patreon. There is a link below to that. Or you can, of course, send me some love through PayPal or whatever. Thanks for your viewership and your support, and I will see you guys next week. Bye-bye.